welcome to ILTV's Israel Weekly, where we discuss the latest in Israel's geopolitical developments. I'm Aaron Porras, and here with me today in the studio are Dr. Martin Sherman, the founder and executive director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies, and Colonel in the Reserves Miri Eisen, who was a former media advisor to two prime ministers and served in the IDF intelligence community for over 20 years. Thank you both of you for coming, first of all. All right, now today our topics for discussion include Interpol's latest decision to induct the Palestinian Authority into its ranks and the alleged politics of the Israeli High Court. So to begin, recently Israel celebrated 50 years since the beginning of the settlement enterprise in the Golan Heights, Jordan Valley, and Judea and Samaria, commonly known as the West Bank, by hosting a major anniversary event in the Gush Etzion settlement block. Tons of high profilers and the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself spoke at the event, but the big news is on who wasn't there. Despite a petition from an NGO to compel participation, there was no representation at the event from the Israeli High Court of Justice. The court's president, Miriam Naor, said a court presence would be akin to taking a political stance, which the court simply wasn't willing to make. However, to many, the court's absence was itself a political statement. That seemed to signify an opposite stance to that of the Prime Minister.
ההתיישבות חשובה לכם, חבריי, באותה מידה היא חשובה לי. ולכן אני אומר, לפני הכל, ובאופן ברור, לא תהיה יותר עקירה של יישובים בארץ ישראל.
So I'm going to open with you, Colonel, should the court have been there? Did they make the right decision? And why or why not?
Oh, so now I'm supposed to be able to say if the High Court of Israel is the one who made the right decision. First of all, they made a decision. That's their prerogative. It's what they do all of the time. In this case, I like to look at this sense. You know, there's a list, which is true in any country, of events that the different elements of the country are supposed to come to. When you have dignitaries who come, when they arrive, when presidents arrive, you have these different places where she's supposed to show up, she being the president of the court today in that sense. In this case, I asked the question of why did she say yes and then say no? And why only in hindsight was this seen as a political event? If this event was an event of the government of the State of Israel, the government invited you, then all of the different state officials are supposed to be here. It's not just the High Court. If it wasn't a state event and not everybody was invited, why are they only focusing on the absence of the High Court?
So are you saying that, because this was a state-sponsored event, then really she should have been there simply because it was a state-sponsored event, regardless of politics?
But that's my problem, is that they didn't invite everybody. If they had invited everybody, and it was all of the people that you have at every single state official thing, which is the chief of staff and the chief of police. There are different dignitaries and diplomats. That's who you invite when it's a state event. But this wasn't a state event. It was a government event. And in that sense, it does leave that open to that question. As I said, if they had invited everybody and she was the only one who didn't show up, I'd be worried about it. But they invited the Supreme Court, and they didn't invite all of the other people who were on that regular list of state-sponsored events.
Well, that's a little disingenuous, because I don't know of anyone else who was invited and refused the invitation.
But why didn't they come? Why weren't they invited?
I have no idea who was invited and who wasn't invited. I do know that the event was declared a state event, Iroa Mamlechti.
I agree.
And the government is the body charged with defining events as whether they're state events or not. But I think beyond that, the whole issue of, or the whole argument that the president of the High Court put forward for not attending is ridiculous.
Which is that
it was political.
Was
political. On the 5th of October 1995, Yitzhak Rabin gave an address asking for parliamentary ratification of Oslo II. And in that address, he said the following things. The permanent solution will include a Palestinian entity, which will be an entity that is less than a state. We will not return to the June 1967 lies, and these are the main changes, not all of them, which we envision and want to in the permanent solution. First and foremost, a united Jerusalem, which will include both Ma'ale Adumim and Givat Ze'ev, these are settlements, as the capital of Israel under Israeli sovereignty. The security border of the State of Israel will be located in the Jordan Valley, which means all the settlements there also were
interesting, Martin. I never saw you as somebody who supports Prime Minister Rabin's position.
One second. changes will include the addition of Gush Etzion, Efrat, Beitar, and other communities, most
Well,
of
why
which
is that
are
relevant
east of the
22
Green.
years later?
Because that's what the country was sold was sold to the country as Oslo. Now that then was considered a far left concessionary position, and then the final one, by the way, is very
But you're
interesting.
giving me
The final
ancient history
No,
as
I'm not
far
giving
as
you
you
ancient.
usually
No,
present it.
but
22 years ago, we're talking about today.
22 years ago. So but everything could be everything can be controversial. Gay marriage could be controversial. Shops open on Saturday could be controversial. Everything is controversial. This was never controversial, and it's only become controversial because of the resistance of the far left. The far left,
but here was the question was about why they're not participating.
Why they're not participating? Because it's controversial. It shouldn't be controversial.
But you're agreeing that it is controversial?
I'm agreeing it's been made controversial by marginal elements who reflect the High Court decision, which brings us back to a previous discussion that we had about the political intervention of the High Court. The High Court is making a political statement that these settlements are at least of questionable legitimacy. Whereas,
well, as the State of Israel has not applied Israeli law to it, I think that what the High Court is showing is that the Israel legislator, the Israel government, the one that in this case Benjamin Netanyahu leads, this government, not a different one, has not changed the legal status of Judea and Samaria from a different legal status than the one that we have here sitting at a studio in Tel Aviv.
But the legal status wasn't under discussion. The discussion was the establishment of communities which across the board,
but that's the
board of the
difference.
mainstream.
The Golan Heights in 1981, the government of the State of Israel and then the Knesset of the State of Israel applied Israeli law.
Jerusalem,
this is not the rule of law. It wasn't passed as legislation.
The Golan settlements. The Golan settlements were also part of the ceremony.
It was done in the Etzion block in the West Bank in an area that this government,
where some of the judges live. It
has nothing to do with it. It has to do with where we've applied Israeli law.
But basically, so what? So if they've invited the chief of police, he won't come there because it's not Israeli law? I don't understand.
First of all, I made a different point about the issue of who's invited and not invited.
I think what's interesting
what is
to know
a state event? If this is defined by the government, the body authorized to define it as a state event,
then
and
there
the High
is a
Court
protocol.
decides, and the High Court
then there is
decides
a protocol. Somebody who's served there of who's supposed to be invited.
So,
it's protocol.
So I'd like to know, do you think that you're talking about the High Court as if they've made a political statement regardless, and is this a trend? Do you think have they been making political statements? And if they have, then why?
This has been the whole whole argument about why one of the arguments why judicial reform is necessary, and because the High Court has identified itself with a clear political line. And it's imposing its will on a public which, in large measure, has a different view.
Then they should change the legislation.
Of course, that's what they're trying to do. That's precisely what they're trying to do.
But they haven't, have they yet? They haven't, have they yet?
They haven't, but that's precisely the trend.
But that's one of the aspects that to me is always interesting, is that we all take for granted that we live in a democracy. But the democracy is not about the rule of the majority based in the legislator. Democracy is about the balance between three different
Which
arms: the
is precisely
executive,
the aim of the reform,
legislator,
which is precisely
and
the aim
the
of the
judicial,
reform,
which is to make the judicial less.
Which is to make to prevent the judiciary becoming tyrannical.
I agree with you absolutely that they should not be more, but it's about balance.
No, it's not about balance because the judiciary can undermine any law.
So you're saying the judiciary should be under the executive and the legislature?
I should say the judiciary should be in charge of interpreting laws, not making them.
I don't think they make
So
laws,
then again, I mean, how does that have anything to do with how does the interpretation of laws have anything to do with whether or not they wanted to attend an event where not everybody across the political aisle was invited?
I don't know who was not invited across the political aisle. I find it very difficult to believe that invitations weren't extended. I know that very few opposition members attended the ceremony, although they were invited, which in itself shows that they were trying to give it a political
But isn't it interesting that if it's a state-sponsored event, I mean, I know that we both know protocol. Protocol is protocol. There's this list. People go down the list and you show up. If you don't show up, you have to send somebody in their stead. That wasn't the way that this event was presented from the beginning. So
I don't
from
know-
the
I don't
start,
know. If they were invited, what was the argument of not going? That it's beneath our dignity?
no,
That it
the
what?
idea in that sense is that it was one that was presenting a specific political position in Israel, which can have a majority, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other voices. But it wasn't placed there, Martin, as something that all of the protocol of the State of Israel and the government and the executive and the legislator and the diplomats, as I said, that protocol calls for a very specific list of people who are invited, of positions, not
Who was
people.
not invited?
First of all, neither of us know the list.
No, there was
So,
none of us know this,
let's
but we
see.
don't know
Did-
anyone.
was
We
the
don't
chief
know-
of staff
we
there?
don't, he wasn't there. I don't know why he wasn't
Okay.
there.
Was
but he
the
was
chief of
invited.
police there?
I don't know.
Okay, I mean, those are the other ones that are invited in the same situation.
The question is the argument that for the High Court not attending was that it was not a state event, but it was defined a state event by the body in charge of defining the state event.
I'm just disagreeing with you completely. Again, there's
That
a
was the
difference
argument. That's what
between...
they put forward.
I'd like to know, again, if, because you can attribute a political stance to any and all actions from anybody realistically. You can say, he did this and he didn't do that. He said this, he didn't say that, and therefore he must support, X, Y, and Z. So is that not what's happening here?
I'm not sure that I follow you.
Are we not maybe kind of attributing politics to something that truly wasn't a political stance? I mean, perhaps, again, I'm devil's advocate here, as if the court's job is to interpret laws, then and they're not supposed to make political statements, and then they're looking at this and they said, okay, if we attend, that's making a political statement, so we're going to refrain. Would that not be
if it
what
was
you
defined
want
as a political
them to do?
event, yes, but it was defined as a state event.
Actually, no, it wasn't
It
defined
was
as a state.
a state event.
And within it, it was like this interesting way of doing so. But I'll add something else, that in the 50-year anniversary to the amazing reunification of the city of Jerusalem, where Israel applied Israeli law in '67 and then passed it as a basic law in 1980, there was no question whatsoever. Everybody attended. Jerusalem was passed as a law. In the Golan Heights, if you do such a thing, it was passed as a law. But Martin, there is a difference in the physical status of both the Etzion block where it took place and of the other communities that live in Judea and Samaria. And if this government and this legislator doesn't change that, then the Supreme Court takes a step back and says, in the meantime, that area is in dispute. I'm not stepping into there. I don't see that as something...
So the High Court doesn't hear any disputes or adjudicate any disputes that occur in Judea and Samaria?
When they look at them, they're
they
looking
do.
at them with that lack of legislation. Legislate, and then things will
Well,
change.
I could accept
I
that.
think on that note-
I could accept that. Just to be fair, I could accept that if the High Court said no, we cannot deal with any petitions that come from Judea and Samaria, but they do. So
We
it
do
seems
have military rule
it
over
seems
it,
a double standard.
but it's
Well,
military.
I think that if the court looks into something that is brought to them, regardless of where it is, then they would have an obligation as their job as the court to look into it. But I'm not really sure how that
But
would
the argument
extend.
was controversial. Not that it was.
Well, I mean,
it wasn't a legal
any court
argument.
decision
It
could
was.
be.
It was a value based.
The idea that perhaps it's something that hasn't yet been decided in Israeli society and
Many
in
things
Israeli
haven't been decided. Or many
government.
things are controversial.
All right, on that note, I think we really do have to move on. So, moving on to bigger world news in the world of policing, actually. Despite years of protestations from Israel and some of her allies, the Palestinian Authority has now become the only, if not one of the only entities to be accepted into Interpol without yet being a nation. Israel has long argued that the Palestinian Authority should not be allowed to unilaterally join any international organizations until coming to the negotiating table, and specifically should be barred from Interpol because it could allow intel on past and ongoing Israeli operations to fall into the wrong hands. Now, the Palestinian Authority, on the other hand, is lauding the decision, of course.
هذا انتصار ساحق للدبلوماسية الفلسطينية، وهذا تأكيد أن القيادة الوطنية الفلسطينية والقيادة السياسية الفلسطينية تعمل من أجل وضع فلسطين على المنبر الدولي ووجودها في المنظمات الدولية.
So, Martin, I'm going to open the first question to you this time. In previous votes where the Palestinian Authority tried to enter Interpol, they got 2/3 vote against them. In this last vote, it was 2/3 overwhelmingly for them. What do you think changed since the last vote?
Well, I'm not sure what changed, and it's a bit surprising. But I think the fundamental question or the fundamental issue is that we are now reaping the bitter fruits of Netanyahu's Bar Ilan speech, where he recognized the acceptability of Palestinian statehood. Because in a stroke, he changed the strategic dialogue from whether or not there should be a Palestinian state to what the characteristics of the state should be. And that's a completely different kettle of fish. And I think he made a big mistake in thinking that he could fine-tune the kind of characteristics he would allow the Palestinian state to have. Because once you acknowledge that the Palestinians have an authentic claim to statehood, they've got a claim to statehood, and you can't put limitations on their demands for statehood. For instance, you can't demand that it be democratic, because you don't demand that of Sudan or Somalia or Saudi Arabia. So the root of the problem goes down to the acceptance of a Palestinian state, and as long as Israel adheres to that policy, it will suffer defeat after defeat after defeat. I find myself agreeing with Professor Eugene Kontorovich, who remarked on this. Israel's diplomatic defeat, talking about the Interpol issue, shows the weakness of its purely reactive, defensive diplomatic posture. Unless it is willing to pursue aggressive strategies that would put the PA government on the defensive, losses like this one are inevitable. And I agree with him almost completely, except that I think that once you recognize that there's a PA or Palestinian Authority, you have to treat it as at least a semi-sovereign entity.
So, but now that we're in the situation that we're in, because that's good as a hypothetical of what we should have done to perhaps prevent Interpol from inducting the Palestinian Authority, but the reality is that they're there now. So what do we do now?
So first of all, here we are and we're going to live it. There's a really big difference for me as an Israeli security person when it comes to Interpol. First of all, I'll remind everybody that 24 countries voted against us, with Israel against being accepted, and those are the countries that matter to us. So it's not just a question that 2/3 were for. That's the same 2/3 that are for Palestine in every situation. To me, it's important that there are still 24 countries that matter to us that voted against. They understand it. But specifically when it comes to Interpol, I really feel the two-sided sword. Israel does not want to be the police force in Judea and Samaria for the Palestinians. We do not want to be the force that has to go in to arrest men for domestic abuse, for rape, for people who are, thieves and etc. We don't want to be the one who's doing that. That's a real challenge in areas A and B. And in area B, Israel has the security responsibility, but even there we don't want to do the policing. And I'll add in that even we're looking at the security angle of anti-terrorism, but there's also policing. So on the one hand, I'm saying if it's a criminal, then we want to have cooperation because we don't want to have to do it. And they're doing the policing now. They've been doing it pretty much for the last 10 years. It started 2006, 2007, rebuilt. This is, by the way, only in the West Bank. It has nothing to do with the Gaza Strip. But what it enables is for Israel not to do so. That in its own way is something that I'm looking at as not a bad thing. But I have to tell you, I am really worried because in every international forum that the Palestinians come in as Palestine and as an independent state, all they do is use it to bash Israel, period. So that there's nothing good that's going to come out of this. It isn't about policing. It isn't about anti-criminal. It's about bashing Israel.
Well, I agree completely with Miri, and I think that indicates or underscores the basic flaw in the two-state policy. Because whatever you do, that's what the Palestinians are going to use. Whatever forum they enter. And until Israel begins to extricate itself from its commitment to a two-state policy, we will suffer similar defeats, and it will be accelerating and accelerating until you will have a mega Gaza perched on the hills overlooking Greater Tel Aviv, the Ben Gurion runway, and Highway 6. That's the inevitable trajectory of recognizing that the Palestinians have an authentic claim for statehood. And unless we can get out of that, there will be no solution.
But going back to Interpol, let's look at some of the real threats that their membership poses. In what way will Interpol become a tool of the Palestinian Authority? Because the UN, they can get up on the floor in the plenum and bash Israel, but how does that work in Interpol?
Well, in Interpol, the first thing is when they define, who the criminal is, and then they say to the other members of Interpol, this person is a criminal and needs to be arrested, because there are all sorts of different ways that they do so in coordination, things that we kind of want to have happen, that criminals won't be able to escape countries, go into other countries, and find safe haven there. Doesn't that sound like a good idea? But what happens in this case? Are they now going to define Israeli police officers, let alone Israeli military officers, as criminals that now they can put out in some of the countries of that 2/3 that recognize Palestine and say Israelis can't go there because they're suddenly going to find that they're on the Interpol wanted list? That's a terrible misuse of what until now has been something which is very professional. We do not want to be in that situation where we find our soldiers, our police officers, all of the ones who are policing in the West Bank in any way in the areas of the Palestinian Authority suddenly being charged with criminal offenses. I'll remind everybody that Israel is a member of Interpol. We never became a member. We're not a member of the International Court of Justice. And we're not a member of that because we will not allow ourselves to be a member of that one, which basically bashes Israel. In this case, we were active members of Interpol. We were part of that world that tries to stop criminals. And I'm very worried of that way that you can abuse the term criminal when it comes to the Palestinian Authority.
How can Israel, because Israel is, as you just said, also an active member of Interpol, how can Israel defend against possible attacks like what you've just described?
I'll just add a little one is the 24 countries who voted against the Palestinians being part of Interpol are those 24 countries of North America, Western Europe, who understand the intricacies of what it involves and the fact that this isn't just a little simple, oh, they're members of it, of the opening up of information. You work then in ways where it's in singular groups as opposed to working openly with all of the members of Interpol.
Well, I agree with much of what was said here. And the danger is the issue of what's called red notices that can be distributed to different countries and be used to pursue Israeli officers or Israeli security personnel as criminals. I'm sure, and I think some American officials have gone on record saying that they will not recognize red notices issued under these circumstances under Palestinian pressure. But I think it's wrong to look at the Interpol incident in isolation. It's part of an ongoing trend, and the root of all evil is recognizing Palestinian claim to statehood. Because once you recognize that, you can't stop these things.
I see. So, do you think that Israel might leave Interpol? And what would be?
I don't. I really don't. I think that Israel is part of the international community and we're part of the international security community and we have a place there. And if we're showing now Great Britain or Interpol or the different things that happen, we have both a status there and it's important because, ladies and gentlemen, there are criminals in the world. I mean, at the end, this is something that the international community can do a lot for. They're not only members of Interpol, I agree with Martin. They are now becoming, this is part of their endeavor, and every single forum they can find, they want to be members of it. They are in the Olympic community and they are in FIFA. I mean, it's both in sports and in its policing. I think that the uniqueness is that Interpol, for me, until they joined, was one where it was security arena separate. And here is the first time that I'm seeing a real opening where we share intelligence information. And it's kind of odd to be sitting in the same room where we're not sharing with them about terrorism. This is about criminals. And we're going to find that it's going to be used against us because there is no agreed upon definition for terrorist. And because of that, I just see how this issue of the term criminal being abused.
It will be diluted, possibly.
Absolutely.
All right, well, we have very, very little time left. I'm sorry, but we're going to move on to our final word. So, that silver lining, I'm going to give 30 seconds to each. Martin, let's start with you.
Well, I think the silver lining is the expansion and the growth and the bolstering of the settlement enterprise. I think that is a great source of pride and encouragement for the Zionist entity.
Okay.
I think that on this Jewish New Year and together with Sukkot, we're saying that Israel is thriving on many different levels. And I think that in that sense of being able to talk about issues and joint issues, we're going to find ways to go there as long as we're strong. Our strength with our capability to endlessly talk, that's going to go with us a long way.
All right, excellent. Now, all right, that's unfortunately all the time that we have today for this edition of ILTV's Israel Weekly. Thanks again to our guests, Colonel Eisen and Dr. Sherman, for joining us, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you next week, and shalom from Israel.